How about that?
There you go.
Okay, awesome. Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started. So my name is Laura Griffin. I am the Family and Consumer Science Agent here in Pueblo County. So welcome to all of you who have joined us for not only this class, but some of our previous classes. We have one class left after this in 2 weeks, and we will be talking about pickling. So if you haven't signed up for that yet, definitely encourage you to do so. But today we are going to be talking about pressure canning low acid foods. So I think this is always kind of a interesting topic for people. It can be a little bit intimidating at first, and you know, there are some pretty serious health risks if you are doing pressure canning incorrectly. So we're definitely going to go over all of the important steps to make sure that we are pressure canning safe food for our friends and family. All right, so just a little bit of background information. I know most of you have joined us for previous classes, but there are two main methods of canning. So the first that we have talked about previously is going to be our boiling water bath canning, and that's going to be used for our acidic foods or foods with a pH of 4.6 or less. So we can water bath can products such as fruits, pickles, jams, jellies, other fruit spreads, things like that. Our other type of canning is going to be pressure canning, which we will be focusing on today. And that is appropriate for low acid foods. So it means that they are more basic and they have a pH of above that 4.6. So this is going to work best for our vegetables and any meat products. So meats, poultries, fish, and then any mixed foods as well. So if we're doing like soups or stews or chilies that are going to have a mixture of maybe beans, vegetables, meat products, those would need to be pressure canned as well. So why do we have two methods of canning? And really the answer comes down to Clostridium botulinum. And that's the bacteria that causes botulism poisoning. So this is a very serious concern for improperly home canned goods. And essentially, most yeasts, molds, and bacteria can be pretty safely destroyed by boiling temperatures. So that's going to be about 212 degrees at sea level. So with that, we can destroy, you know, most of our foodborne illness causing bacteria and other yeasts and molds. But the Clostridium botulinum bacteria specifically, they actually form spores. And those spores are extremely heat resistant. So they're not going to be destroyed by that boiling temperature alone. They actually require a temperature of more like 240 degrees. And again, that's at sea level. So we have a little bit of an adjustment there as well. But just to give you an idea, we have to get about 30 degrees higher to destroy this Clostridium botulinum spores. And we can't do that by boiling it alone. So we need that pressure from the pressure canning to actually increase the temperature to that 240 degrees. With the Clostridium botulinum, why we can water bath can some products is because although those spores are very heat resistant, they actually can't survive in an acidic environment. So as long as the pH of your food is below that 4.6, then we can go ahead and safely water bath can those products. And not only will that acidity destroy those spores, but the boiling temperatures will also help to destroy most of those other foodborne illness causing bacteria. So that's why things like pickles, where we have that added vinegar for acidity, and naturally acidic products such as fruits don't need to be pressure canned. But some of those foods, like those vegetables and meat products, we just can't make them acidic enough to be safe for water bath canning. So we do need that extra pressure to increase our temperature in order to destroy that bacteria and their spores. All right, so pressure canning gone wrong. I think this is a lot of people's fears when they think about pressure canning. We've seen photos like this, you know, circulating on the internet maybe, but I would like to reassure you that this is almost impossible to make happen, especially with the pressure canners that we have right now. They have multiple built-in safety features that, like I said, you almost have to try to make this happen and just ignore your pressure canner for hours on end, have it turned up all the way to high to make this happen. But understandably, people seem to have a little bit of a fear of pressure canning. Even pressure cookers sometimes can be a little bit intimidating, but we hope by the end of this class that you feel much more confident in your pressure canning abilities. All right, so this is the basic anatomy of our pressure canners. So just like with the water bath canning, we want to start with a flat rack on the bottom of the canner, and that's just where our jars will sit. Next, we have either a pressure regulator or indicator. And so we can see that is directly in the center on the top of the lid. And there's actually two ways that we measure or regulate our pressure within pressure canners. So there's two main types of pressure canners. We have a dial gauge pressure canner, and then we also have a weighted gauge pressure canner. So depending on the type that you have, the top of your lid will look a little bit different. And we'll go through some specifics to each of those in a little bit. And then we also, next to that pressure regulator on the lid, we'll have a vent pipe. So it sticks up a little bit off the top of the lid and it vents steam through it and helps with our pressurizing process. We also have several safety features, like I mentioned. So we have a safety valve or overpressure plug. And the overpressure plug is essentially just a rubber plug that sits in the lid. And if for any reason that pressure did become too high within the pressure canner, that plug is actually going to pop out and it's going to depressurize the canner immediately. So like I said, it's almost impossible to completely blow the lid off of the canner because those safety features are in place. There is also a safety cover lock when the pressure is building in the pressure canner. So that's an additional locking feature that locks that lid into place on the canner. And then finally, depending on the type of canner that you have, you'll either have a flexible gasket, so that'll be a rubber ring that fits into the top of your lid, or you'll have a metal to metal seal that seals your lid front to the canner without any sort of gasket. All right, so our first type of pressure canner is going to be a dial gauge. And so with these, typically the Presto dial gauge canner is going to be our most popular model of these. They run about $100, so not too incredibly expensive as far as pressure canners go. But you'll see a dial like you see here in this photo on the top of your lid. And that dial goes from 0 to 20 PSI and then has a caution range, which we don't ever want our pressure to go above that 20 PSI. But essentially, this uses this specific dial to indicate the pressure inside the canner. And so some of the pros and cons to this, first, it must be checked for accuracy. So this dial over time, over use, it can actually get a little bit off. And so we want to make sure that we're testing it at least annually to make sure that it's actually accurate. Because the last thing we want to do is, go through all these steps, take all of our time, process all this food. We think we processed it at 15 PSI. And then later on, you find out that your gauge was a little bit off and you actually only processed it at 12. Making that food not only unsafe, but also wasting all of that time and resources. So before you start each year, before you start for the season, we would ask that you bring in your dial gauge for testing. And we can do that here at the Extension office for free. It doesn't take very long. You can give me a call anytime and we can set up an appointment. If you want to wait and I'm available, it usually only takes about 10 to 15 minutes. If not, you can always drop it off and I can always get it back to you within a day or two. So definitely if you have the dial gauge, make sure you're planning ahead for that. So we make sure that your food is still being processed safely. And if you have to replace the dial, the canner is a big investment, but these smaller pieces, they do wear out over time, but they're very easy to just order and replace and not very expensive. So that's always an easy fix. One of the advantages to the dial gauge is it does give you more flexibility in altitude adjustments because you have smaller PSI increments. So as you can see, it goes from 0 to 20. So for some recipes here in Colorado, we're looking at altitude adjustments that may call for 12 PSI or 13 PSI. So with the dial gauge, you can accommodate that directly. With the weighted gauge, you're going to have a little bit less flexibility with that. Another thing to note with the dial gauge is that it has a counterweight. So the counterweight can look very similar to a weighted gauge, but this is not a weighted gauge. It is simply used to close the vent port for pressurizing. So that's not going to indicate the pressure. With the dial gauge, we're using the dial to indicate that pressure. And then with the dial gauge, the pressure is going to be increased or decreased by adjusting your stove burner heat. So you'll kind of keep an eye on that dial. If it needs to increase in pressure a little bit, you want to bump up that temperature a little bit. If it needs to decrease, if we're getting close to that caution range, then you'll go ahead and back off on that burner heat a little bit. So that's how you'll adjust that. The other option is going to be a weighted gauge. And there's a couple different varieties of these as well. But essentially, you're using these predetermined weights to create the correct pressure within your pressure canner. So the first one is that little circular device up in the right-hand corner. This is a one-piece weighted gauge. And as you can see, it has 3 holes on the outside, and they are labeled 5, 10, and 15. So with the weighted gauge, we don't have that option to pressure can something at 12 PSI or 13 PSI. Your only options are going to be 5, 10, or 15. And whether that comes in the one piece like we see there, or the 3-piece, which has these rings that stack for every 5 PSI that we need, those are going to be our only processing options. So it's really not a big deal. You always want to always over pressurize rather than under pressurize if you are using a recipe that is in the middle. So if we need to process something at 12 or 13 PSI because of altitude adjustments, we would always bump it up to 15 with a weighted gauge. So if you have a weighted gauge and you live in Colorado, everything that you process will be at that 15 PSI. But essentially how these work is you place them either on the correct hole on the top one or with the correct number of rings for the 3-piece one over your vent pipe, and they start to rock back and forth. And it can be a little bit hard to determine what that rocking is supposed to look like at first. So I always recommend checking out, some YouTube videos and kind of getting a feel for how fast they're supposed to be rocking back and forth before you get started. But they should have a pretty good but gentle rock to them when they're at full pressure. So if the weighted gauge is just sitting on top of that pressure port, it's not at pressure yet. And if it's getting to the point that it's almost falling off of that pressure port because it's rocking so violently, then you probably want to back it off a little bit. But you should be hearing that kind of clicking as it rocks back and forth for the entire time that you are processing. All right, so I think I went over most of this already, but the weighted gauge, that gauge that you place over the port is what regulates the pressure inside the canner rather than the dial. So you place that over the same open vent that the pressure regulator fits on. So the kind of nice thing about the weighted gauge is that they don't have to be tested for accuracy. So the weights on these are not going to change. So essentially we don't have to have that annual checkup to make sure that things are still working properly. And again, for altitude adjustments, we can only increase by 5 psi. So again, for us here in Colorado, everything that we process will have to be at that 15 mark. All right, and then our third model, this is called the All-American pressure canner. And as you can see on the top of it, it has both a dial and a weighted gauge on it. But this is truly should be used as a weighted gauge canner. So it has a dial on the top of it, but that dial is really only to determine when the canner has depressurized to 0. So it just helps give you an idea of when that canner is starting to go to pressure and when it's reached back to 0. That dial should not be used to determine the exact pressure within the pressure canner. This model works as a weighted gauge. This is kind of the Cadillac model of pressure canners. It's probably the largest pressure canner out there, and it's also definitely the most expensive. These will run you about $400 to $600 depending on the model that you buy, but they will last forever. So if you are interested in a really high quality canner that is going to last forever, maybe that's a good option for you. All right, pressure canners versus pressure cookers. So pressure cookers have really kind of resurged in popularity over the last few years with our, Ninja brands and our Instant Pots. A lot of these cookers are being advertised as multi-cookers, 4-in-1s, 5-in-1s, 10-in-1s that do all these different things. And a lot of them are advertised that they can do pressure canning. Some of them even have recipes associated with them, but we highly recommend against using pressure cookers for any canning purposes. The USDA has very strict set guidelines for what a pressure canner must entail, and most of these cookers do not meet those requirements. So from a bare minimum, to be considered a pressure canner, the USDA requires that the canner hold at least 4 quart-sized jars. So that's a pretty large volume that most of these pressure cookers are not going to accommodate. The pressure canners, if you've ever seen one or if you have one, they also have extremely thick walls, the metal walls. They're very solid. They're going to be a lot heftier than most of our pressure cookers. And those differences in the sidewalls as well as the size change how fast things come to pressure, how fast they depressurize, and all of that is factored into our tested recipes that we use. So by using a much smaller, lighter weight cooker or canner, then that's going to change our overall formula just for how things process. There also may not be enough heat delivered during pressurization and the cool down periods in the smaller pressure cookers or saucepans. So we would not recommend using pressure canning or pressure cookers for any sort of canning purposes. We've also had conversations with some of these major cooker brands, and they have not taken altitude adjustments into account when they produce their recipes, which are nationally published. So we're working through that with some of these brands, but for now, really just stay clear of the canning in the cookers. All right, another thing to be aware of, if you have an electric cooktop or a glass top stove, you want to be careful canning on it in general, but especially pressure canning, because again, these canners are very large, they're very heavy, and we're filling them with heavy jars of food. So that is a lot of weight strain to put on certain types of cooktops. So if you have a smooth top stove, we always recommend that you check the manufacturer's guidelines or call the manufacturer to see if canning is recommended on them. That weight can sometimes be too much and it can actually crack your glass top stove. So we want to be aware of that. Some of them say that they can handle the canning. Some of them say that it's not recommended. So you always want to double check that before you get started. And if you do have any type of cooktop, the canner should be no more than 4 inches wider in diameter than the element on which it's heated. So some cases, some of our burners are not going to be large enough to accommodate canning on them. So you want to make sure that you're using the largest burner available and that it does meet those recommendations. All right, so now we're going to get into some of the specifics of how we actually go through the pressure canning process. So first and foremost, just like with all of our other types of food preservation, we always want to begin with a tested recipe and instructions. So I'm sure I'm sounding like a broken record by now, but essentially a tested recipe is a recipe that has undergone extreme amounts of trials and research from either a research lab on a university campus or some other type of certified food lab. And they really test all aspects of these recipes to not only ensure that they're going to be a safe product, but also a good quality tasting product and a good quality looking product. So they take all of that into effect with food safety being their top priority. So all of these recipes are going to be altitude adjusted, which again is very important for those of us who live at altitude here in Colorado. There's plenty of places that you can find these tested recipes. So don't think that just because we're looking for a tested recipe that you're going to be limited on the types of foods that you can preserve. But CSU Extension, we have a bunch of great tested recipes available on our website. So you can check that out. We also have a new Preserve Smart app that you can download on your smartphone or tablet. That's going to be full of a bunch of great recipes as well. Any other state extension service will offer tested recipes as well if they have some sort of food lab or food program. The National Center for Home Food Preservation is always a great resource. They're through the University of Georgia Extension, and they have a lot of great recipes as well as just resources on all things food preservation. And then finally, we have a few different recipe books. These books are available to purchase here at the Pueblo County CSU Extension office, or you can find them at Barnes & Noble or through Amazon. But we have the So Easy to Preserve, the Ball Blue Book, the Ball Complete Book of Home Preserving, and the USDA Complete Guide to Home Canning. All right. So once we have our recipe, we know that it's from a tested and reliable source. Then it's time to start getting to work. So first and foremost, we're going to place our canner on our burner, making sure that there's no more than 4 inches between the diameter of that canner and the burner. We're going to put the rack at the bottom of our canner, and then we're going to fill it with about 2 to 3 inches of hot water. So this is kind of a large difference between the water bath canning and the pressure canning. With the water bath canning, we have to fill our canner with enough water that those jars are completely submerged by 2 to 3 inches. Whereas with the pressure canner, we really only need about 2 to 3 inches of water in the bottom of the canner. So we don't have to completely fill it up. We don't even have to fill it up halfway. We don't have to submerge our jars. Just need about 2 to 3 inches in the bottom of that canner. And the reason for that is that we're not boiling these jars, but rather we're using the steam from that water to create pressure within the canner to process them. So that's how we prepare our canner. And then we're just going to go ahead and prepare the food according to the tested recipe. So this can vary pretty dramatically, but just like with all types of canning and food preservation, really the most important thing is that you're following the instructions explicitly. So we want to make sure that we're not, changing or removing or adding a lot of ingredients or ratios of ingredients. We want to be very mindful that these tested recipes were tested exactly as they are written. And so we want to maintain that as closely as possible when we reproduce them to create a safe product. So we're just going to prepare that food according to the tested recipe. Like I said, it varies dramatically depending on, you know, if you're canning green beans or you're canning fish or making a soup or a stew or a chili. Those are all going to look a little bit different, but just make sure that you're following those recipes exactly. So once you've prepared your food as to the instructions, you're going to go ahead and fill your jars with those foods. And you're going to want to make sure that you're leaving accurate headspace. So for the headspace of pressure can products, that's generally going to be 1 inch. And that headspace is going to be just the space between the top of the jar and the top of the food in the jar. So we want to leave a little bit of room to make sure that that food can expand without breaking or cracking any of our jars. So once our jars are full, we're going to place the lid on top of them, secure that lid with our screw band, and then you're going to go ahead and place your jars into your canner. And once our jars are full and the lids are on, we want to do our best to disturb the jars as little as possible. So we want to lift them straight up, straight over, and straight down into the canner as best we can. And the reason for that is we don't want to tilt them, we don't want to shake them. Any sort of movement like that can actually cause our seals to not seal properly. So anything that maybe gets up under that lid, or if there's, you know, any slight contamination between that jar and that lid, that seal is likely to fail. And then we can't store that food at room temperature for an extended period of time. So we don't want to go to all this trouble just to have none of our jars seal. So once we've loaded our jars in the canner, we're going to go ahead and fasten our canner lid on securely, and we're going to leave our weight off the vent pipe. So depending on the type of pressure canner you have, some of them have a screw top base. So you can see in this photo here, there's notches that protrude out from the base of the canner. And so with that lid, it's going to fit over those notches, and then you turn it and it locks into place. With the All-American brand, it actually has metal screws that you're going to screw into place to connect that lid and the base of the canner. So depending on the type of canner that you have, you'll have to figure out exactly how it fastens into place. And then, like I said, we're going to keep that vent pipe open, and we're just going to turn our heat setting all the way up to start. So we want to get that temperature up and that pressure starting to build inside the canner. And after this, it takes a little bit of time to get to that heat position that we're looking for, but we're looking for that steam to be flowing out of the vent pipe. So like you can see here in this photo, we want that steam to be in a continuous motion, and it should be pretty robust when you start your timer. So we're waiting for that steam to start erupting out of the vent pipe. Once it has a continuous flow and is pretty strong, then we're going to start timing for 10 minutes. And we're just going to allow it to vent that steam for a full 10 minutes. After that 10 minutes is up and that steam has been flowing continuously for that full amount of time, this is where we will either place the counterweight or the weighted gauge over that vent pipe. So if we have a dial gauge, we'll just be placing that counterweight on top of it, and then we'll start to see the pressure rise in that dial. Or we'll be placing that weighted gauge, again, if we're in Colorado, at that 15 PSI, and we'll wait for that weighted gauge to start sort of jiggling on top of that vent pipe. Typically, the canner will pressurize within about 3 to 10 minutes. So again, we're waiting another 5 to 10 minutes, most likely, before you see that we're getting to that point of either the dial showing 15 psi, or that jiggling to occur on the weighted gauge. All right, so then once we are at the appropriate pressure for our tested recipe that has been altitude adjusted, then we can start our timer for the processing time. And with some of our pressure canning recipes, the processing time is pretty extensive. So some of these recipes are going to be, 60 to 120 minutes of processing time. So definitely be prepared for this process, to take all afternoon. So you really want to make sure that you've allowed yourself adequate time to make this process go smoothly. But again, as soon as that pressure has been reached, we can start our timer. Again, probably going to be somewhere between 60 and 120 minutes. So you want to make sure that you're available and that you're able to kind of stay and monitor throughout the process. You want to be able to stay in your kitchen and definitely keep a very close eye on this throughout the whole process. All right, so I've talked a little bit about altitude adjustments for pressure canning, but essentially we must increase the pressure according to the instructions in our tested recipe, since atmospheric pressure gets lower as elevation increases. So this chart just kind of shows you your options. As you can see, there's a lot more options for the dial gauge. So with the weighted gauge, if you're at sea level, which is 0 to 1,000 feet, you're going to be having a pressure of 10 pounds. And anything above that, we're going to go straight to 15. With the dial gauge, the increments are a little bit smaller. So for 0 to 2,000 feet, we're going to be at 11 pounds. For 2 to 4,000, 12 pounds. 4 to 6,000, 13 pounds. 6 to 8,000, 14 pounds. And 8 to 10,000, 15 pounds. So here in Pueblo County, we're at about 4,600 feet. So we would fall into that 4,000 to 6,000 foot category, and we would be processing at 13 pounds. So that is certainly an option for the dial gauge. Honestly, I recommend, especially to people just starting out, to go ahead and go a couple pounds above that. Usually the 15 mark on the dial gauge is a little bit easier to see and a little bit easier to keep track of. And it's not going to hurt your food or anything to process a little bit above that required pressure. So we can't go below. And if we do, we have to start over. But if we are a little bit above, that's going to be totally fine. So I find the 15 is a little bit easier to read on the dial. It also gives you a little bit of wiggle room in case your pressure does start to drop. So if you are processing at 15 and you start to notice your pressure going down a little bit, as long as it doesn't drop below that 13 pounds, then you don't have to start over and you can adjust your heat and try to get that pressure back up before we do have to start over with our processing. All right, so like I said, you want to regulate your heat under the canner to maintain a steady pressure or slightly above that required pressure. And it's very important to note that if at any time the pressure goes below that recommended amount, you actually have to bring it back up to the correct pressure and then begin timing from the beginning. So for the total amount of processing time. So if we're processing a chili for 90 minutes and you make it 60 minutes in, and then you notice that your pressure has gone down below that recommended amount, then we have to actually get back up to pressure and start that 90 minutes all over again. So again, it's very important that, you're very near your canner for the whole time and that you're really keeping a close eye on that to make sure that that doesn't happen. All right, so once we've got through our total processing time, we can go ahead and turn off the heat and remove the canner from heat if possible. So that's going to help it cool down a little bit faster, especially if you have an electric burner where the heat is going to be maintained on that burner for a long time. If you have a gas stove, typically it's not as big of a deal because that heat goes away a lot faster. But like I said, these canners are going to be very hot and they are very heavy. So if you don't feel comfortable moving them to another burner, don't worry about it. Just know that it'll take a little bit longer to cool and depressurize. So after you turn that heat off and or remove it from the heat, that'll just allow the canner to start cooling and depressurizing. And again, this is not necessarily a super quick process. It takes a little bit of time, but we don't want to remove our pressure gauge, our weighted gauge, or our pressure plug, which will release all that steam and basically force cool or force depressurize the canner. We just want to let it depressurize as naturally as possible. All right, so after the canner is completely depressurized to that 0 PSI, then we can go ahead and remove that weight from the vent pipe. And we're gonna start our timer and just wait another 10 minutes to just completely be 100% sure that we are completely depressurized before we remove the lid. Like I said, this is not a super quick process either. The depressurizing of weighted gauge canners, typically for a standard size heavy walled canners, it's going to be about 30 minutes if you have pints in there, or about 45 if it's loaded with quarts. So, if you're new to pressure canning or you've never done it before, I highly recommend going through these steps with your stove and your pressure canner and just taking note of how long this process really takes, because it's going to be a little bit different for everyone, just depending on their personal stove, their burners. It gives you an option to kind of learn where you need to set your burners to maintain those certain pressures. And you can just do this by putting 2 to 3 inches of water in the canner and going through all these steps basically with the canner empty before you start filling jars with food, and you're trying to do all of this for the first time, with a lot of food and a lot of hard work and investment behind that. But I have a note on my phone, and it just has like all the times that it actually takes for each of these steps to occur with my pressure canner and the stove that we have here at the office. So I have a really good idea, that it takes 7 minutes to come to pressure, that it takes 10 minutes for the vent steam process, and so on. But I will say, without the processing time, the rest of this takes about an hour and 10 minutes for my setup. So keep that in mind. You're looking at about an hour of time just between the 10-minute times coming to pressure, depressurizing, and then whatever the processing time is as well. So that can be up to 2 hours. So it's a pretty strong time commitment, especially when you get started. So definitely keep that in mind when you're deciding, when you're going to can, and making sure that you're leaving plenty of time, not only to prep your recipe, but also for the processing. All right, so once we've waited that 10 minutes after we removed our weight, then we can go ahead and unfasten the lid and remove it carefully. So we always want to lift the lid away from our face, just in case there is any residual steam that is still coming out that can burn your hands or your face if lifted near you. And then just like we put the jars into the canner, we want to remove them with just as much care. So again, we still don't know that all of them are sealed yet, so we don't want to disrupt that seal in any way. So we want to remove them by taking them straight up, straight over, and straight down onto either a towel or a cooling rack. So we don't want to place our jars directly on the countertop, because especially during the summer months, if we have our air conditioning running or our fans going, our countertops can become very cool. And we're placing a very, very hot jar onto that cool countertop. The temperature difference can actually cause the jars to crack or break. So just by putting a towel or some sort of cooling rack down, it's going to avoid any issues with that. And then once we have removed our jars, we're just going to let them sit completely undisturbed for about 12 to 24 hours. So we don't want to tighten the screw bands. We don't want to push down on the center of the lid. We don't want to shake them or move them too much. We're just going to give them time to kind of settle and hopefully the seals to start sealing. So the next day or the next morning, you can come back and start checking your lids for a seal. Essentially, the middle of the lid should be concave down. So we can check for that by gently running our finger across the top of the lid. You should feel that concave part in the middle, or you can kind of look at it eye level, and you can usually tell, you can see that concave depression in the middle of the lid. So once these have been sealed, you can go ahead and remove the screw bands from the sealed jars. Those are no longer really functional. The point of the screw bands really just to keep the lid in place during processing. And so we ask that you remove them during storage because they don't really serve a function. And it's a lot easier to tell if something breaks a seal during storage if that screw band is removed. If you notice any sort of residue or any stickiness on the outside of the jar, you can go ahead and wash that off. And then just go ahead and label it and store it in a cool, dry, dark place for up to 1 year. All right, so some additional information on consuming and cooking our low acid canned foods. So when we're reheating any of our low acid canned foods for consumption, we want to boil them before serving. So we're going to boil these foods in a saucepan for 10 minutes plus 1 minute for each 1,000 feet above sea level we are. So again, Pueblo County, we're at about 4,600 feet. So we always round up. So we would add 5 minutes to that 10 minutes. And so we would be boiling these foods for 15 minutes before serving. If for any reason the food looks spoiled, has a foaminess to it, or an off odor during that heating process, then we want to discard immediately. And we do have to boil it for that full amount of time on the stovetop. The microwave is not going to be sufficient because microwave heating is too uneven, so it's not recommended as a reheating method for canned foods. And this reheating step is not meant for foods that have been incorrectly processed. So, you know, if your pressure dropped down a little bit, or maybe you weren't at the correct pressure, or your dial gauge was a little bit off, this is not automatically going to make that food safe just by boiling it. This is just an additional safety step for properly canned low acid foods. All right, so some questions to ask yourself if you're concerned if your pressure canned food is safe to eat or not. But the first is going to be that the food was canned in good condition. The food was processed in a pressure canner. So if it's a low acid food, needs to be processed in that pressure canner. That water bath canner is not going to be sufficient. Again, the pressure canner gauge was accurate. So that means that you've had it tested annually before you started canning for the year and that it was accurate, or you replaced it. That you used an up-to-date research tested process time and pressure. The appropriate jar size was used, the style of pack and the food type was all appropriate for the recipe. The processing times and pressures were adjusted for altitude. The pressure canner was operated properly, so we went through all of those steps that we talked about today. The jar lid is firmly sealed and has that concave middle. Nothing has leaked from the jar. No liquid spurts out when the jar is opened. There's no unnatural or off odors or obvious signs of mold or spoilage. And no mold is growing on the canned food or the surface of the liquid. Just some quick background information on foodborne botulism. So again, the Clostridium botulinum bacteria produces spores that produce very dangerous toxins. It can be one of the most deadly foodborne illness out there. And the foods can contain this toxin without showing any signs. So it's not necessarily going to have an off odor. It's not going to, look like it's molding or decaying in any way. It can be a little bit, scary if you aren't taking the proper precautions when processing these foods. Symptoms are usually onset pretty quickly, so they'll appear within 12 to 72 hours of consumption of that food. And some of the symptoms include digestive upset, difficulty swallowing, speaking, and breathing, blurred double vision, or possible death from suffocation. So again, it can be really serious not to take the proper precautions and steps when pressure canning your foods. All right, so disposing of spoiled home canned foods. So just like with the properly canned foods, we're taking this extra step of boiling those foods just to make sure they're extra safe. We want to do a similar thing if they're for sure spoiled. So if you do notice that off odor, discoloration, foaminess, mold, growth, anything like that, we want to be really careful about how we dispose of this food. So we don't want to just throw it in our trash can, especially even outside where, animals might get into it or something like that. But essentially all you're going to do is boil all of that spoiled low acid food for 30 minutes before disposing of it. So this just helps to destroy any potential toxins present and prevent them from spreading any further. All right, some pressure canning safety tips. So like I said, we don't want to be leaving the kitchen when processing. So prepare yourself to be hanging out in your kitchen for an extended period of time. So we want to make sure that we're sticking close by to that stovetop for that full, 1 to 2 to 3 hours of time, and that we're keeping a really close eye on either that weighted gauge or that dial to make sure that we're maintaining proper pressure. If you have a dial gauge pressure canner, you want to make sure that that dial is getting tested yearly. You also want to just, take a good look at your pressure canner every year. Examine the gaskets or the sealing ring, the pressure plug, the vent pipe, lid lock, make sure everything is in good condition, nothing's starting to rust. The vent pipe, when you hold it up, you should be able to see clearly through it. So that's a good indication that steam can get through it cleanly as well. If you are noticing that anything is starting to wear down or starting to break, you can purchase those replacement parts if needed. And you can always contact your local extension office if you have any questions regarding, recipe selection, processing. We can take a look at your pressure canner, test your dial gauge. We are here for all of those resources. All right, so I know I threw a lot at you in a short amount of time, and pressure canning, it definitely can be one of the more overwhelming topics of food preservation. So if you guys have any questions, feel free to either ask them now or put them in the chat. If you're still kind of processing everything, feel free to reach out to me later in an email or phone call, and we can definitely chat more about any of these topics. And just as a reminder, this class was recorded and you will get a copy of the PowerPoint that we just went through. So that should be coming to you guys in an email with all of that information by the end of the week. All right, so I'm not seeing any questions right off the bat. So I just want to thank you all for joining us this afternoon, learning about pressure canning. Again, our last class of the series will be in 2 weeks, 2 weeks from today, and it will be on pickling. So if you haven't signed up for that, I encourage you to register. And if you have, then I hope you can join us in a couple weeks for that. All right, thank you guys. Hope you all have a great rest of your Wednesday.